Good. Hey. All right, let's get started for today. Let's see, a couple of announcements here. Here's our schedule. As you see, we have a test scheduled for 2 weeks from today. So I thought I'd talk just a slight bit about that. Undoubtedly, someone will eventually ask me about it. So it's going to be here for the on-campus students. It's going to be here during class time and 75 minutes. So it's not going to be the whole week. It's a 75-minute target. The questions will be short answer questions. And so material from class, material from the video modules, all of that's fair game. I try not to do too many detailed kind of programmatic questions in Simio. That's what the case studies are for, is for seeing your ability to implement that. And we kind of try to stay at the conceptual level. So for example, I might ask you something like, describe what a task sequence is. But I'm not going to say, what's the third repeat group in the fourth dialog box or something like that. It's going to be really at the conceptual level. Questions will be short answer. For the first exam, they're not going to have any discussion questions. So we'll just be kind of topical. And I like to think if you come to class or watch the videos, do the assignments, do the practice problems that we talk about in the video, that you should have no problem. That's my serious intent. But as I said on the very first day, this is all new. So every test question you see will be new for this class. So we shall see. So anyone have any questions about the test 2 weeks from today? Okay. Looking back at the schedule also, so here we are in week 5. I put the materials and inventory module up this morning, and it picks up where we leave off today. So from our lecture today, that picks up in that material. And you can see that I have this one more week before the test where I go over the ISO 95 model templates. That might actually shift to after spring break. I haven't really decided exactly how to do it because we are a little bit behind in the material that we need for that template. So I'm trying to work on right now whether I'm going to compress some material, actually have something this week after the exam, or shift everything to week 8. So I'm going to make that decision tomorrow or the next day after I have a chance to look at it. So that's really where we are in schedule. When we get to the ISO 95 model template, whether it's here or here, that's really where we start using the model. So we're going to use the ISO 95 templates for all of the rest of the models that we're going to do for the semester. And the material that we've covered up until now, the data-generated models, task sequences, materials and inventory, is all lead up to applying those templates. And then we just have a couple more topics that we need to talk about before we jump in there. Okay. Anybody have any questions for me? Schedule-wise? Okay. So I have one question that I got on Canvas, and I'm going to talk just briefly about it, not very much about it. You can read it. I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it. It's on Canvas. You can see all my responses on Canvas. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about questions in general and expectations. So you can see that I've highlighted a couple of passages here. And, one of them is this approach correct for defining work schedule? And then the very similar at the very bottom is this approach correct for assigning the work schedule to server 3, server 5, and server 7. So what I would like to see in questions like this is much more detail. Not like, is this the right approach? But I tried it, and here's where I ran into problems, and here's where I used trace, and here's where I used watch, and so on. Just kind of lead along try to find the problem that then I'm more than happy to help you with. Okay, and so I'm suggesting that the question is really, it's premature to ask the question about is just this is the right approach to do it, try it. You know, the whole process of learning how to do modeling, you have to learn how to do modeling. When you graduate and go, I'm not going to be there to answer questions you have about is this the right way to do it or not, nor will, you know, anybody else probably. So the key here is to learn how to use the tools we have. Again, we mentioned it before, trace, watch, and so on, so that you can solve problems and try to identify topical areas and then ask questions, you know, that I can like answer in one answer about, yeah, okay, here's where you went wrong, or here's, you know, what you should try, or something like that, as opposed to the much more general responding to this saying, yeah, these are the right approaches. And then later on getting a question of, okay, well, I tried this, and you know what I'm saying, so just reduce that. That same idea applies when you're sending like tech support requests to someone, is that you need to be more detailed in what you've tried. You know, what have you tried, and what are you seeing, and why is it not working, and so on. Okay? All right. So that's what I had. I didn't have any questions. Anybody else? I have no technical questions about, other than that one, about the case study that's due Friday. So that's either good or bad. It's either good in the sense that nobody has any questions because it's also clear from class in our video modules, or it's bad in the sense that nobody's worked on it enough yet to have questions. Hopefully it's the former. But as usual, I'm happy to answer questions as we go.
I have a question.
Okay.
For case study two, one of the questions is number of late orders.
Mm-hmm.
I come up with this, answering this question in two ways. First one is by using planning set and target summary.
By what now?
Target summary.
Okay.
And the other one is we can use our orders table, and I kept your template there and target shift DTG. Mm-hmm. And both provide us with the answer. So
yeah, I mean, they're both going to provide the same answer, because basically what a target is you define the target as, you know, a range that's defined by the completion date and the due date. That's what a target is. I'm saying, you know, here's my target, or here's the completed value. And for a target, you say, what happens if I'm early? What happens if I'm in the range? And what happens if I'm late? So it's going to do that computation. Since we really only care about late orders, it's going to take the due date. It's going to subtract the completion date. If that number's negative, you're out of the zone and it's going to be late. And so if you don't do a target, you know, if you just do a manual compare of the due date and completion date, you're going to end up with the exact same thing.
So we can use either of them, right?
You can use either of them. Is that it? Was there a second part?
Another one is from last week's video. Auto cancel trigger for process.
Mm-hmm.
We use auto cancel trigger for process, but we already defined setup. So how did you make change for the overall result? Because I think it will not change. It will not make any difference in the end, right?
Well, I mean, again, if you just think of what an auto cancel trigger is, let me put this general task sequence up and say, you know, for any of these tasks, you can have conditional execution. Okay, so let's say this one right here, I have a conditional execution. And I say, if some condition is met, do the task. Otherwise, don't do the task. Okay? Now, if the condition is not met, and you don't do this task, then you're not going to do any of these other tasks if you don't have that immediate predecessor. So what the immediate predecessor tells me is, you know, let's just take these two tasks, whose immediate predecessor is this one, right? By default, that cancel if all immediate predecessors are canceled is set to true. So for these two tasks, if this one doesn't get done, these two won't get done. And if this two don't get done, this one won't get done. Okay? And so if you want this one to be conditional, but these to not be conditional, you have to turn that off. Okay? And so what I did on the setup one is the same thing. If you look at the setup, some of the operations in the model that I defined didn't have a setup. Right? And so there's a condition in the one that I did in the video anyway. There's a condition on this task for setup time equal to 0 or greater than 0. Right? And so if the setup time is 0, this one gets canceled, but I still want to do the process. Just because I have no setup time, I still want to do the process. So for this one, I have to set the auto cancel or whatever that trigger is to false, so that this one gets executed regardless of this one. For this one, it doesn't matter, because since this one I have always executed, it doesn't matter what I have this one set to, because this one will always be executed. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. So I added watch to this, so that what I had last time was trace and Simbits, and I totally forgot about watch, using watch here. So I modified this slide, and instead of going back and showing watch in the same context that I showed these, I'm going to show it in some stuff that I do today. But I wanted to go back and fix this slide, because these are really the three kind of critical things that you use to do debugging and when you're like trying to figure out exactly what's going on. So the watch one, I'll show here in just a second. All right, so what we're going to talk about today are materials and inventory. Materials and inventory element. And sort of as a kind of a historical note, materials and inventory elements in Simio have been really expanded over the past few years. And for our book, they've been expanded since the original writing of the book. So there's not really much coverage of materials and inventory in the book. There will be an edition in the 7th edition. Not going to help any of you guys. Hopefully you'll be graduated by the time we come out with edition 7. So there's really not much coverage in the book, but they're really critical features that have really expanded over the past few years. And so today what I'm going to do in class for lecture is do kind of a high-level discussion, do a little bit of modeling just to get a feel for what it is. And then in the video module, we do a fair amount of detailed modeling. So today, I'm just going to walk through a couple of really, really simple examples. So the basic idea here is if you think about having this assembly operation, so we're going to make this bookshelf. And we have a really simple bill of materials for this bookshelf that says, in order to create a bookshelf, I need 4 pieces of wood. I guess that doesn't make sense because we have 5 levels in our little picture there. And 8 nails. Okay, so in order to create that, I need that, right? So I have that material structure there. And one way that we would think about doing this in Simio is we would represent all of these things as entities. Okay, so I have entities that represent the raw materials, components, and assemblies. Okay, and so I have I have a model here of that. So you can look at that really quickly. So here it is. Here's our bookshelf model that I have the picture of there. And you can see that I have bookshelves and boards that come into subassembly 1. My subassembly 1 is a combiner, and it just says, okay, I need 4 of those guys. So the bookshelf is going to get created and come into the parent. The boards are going to come into the member queue. And so when 4 of them are there, and when 1 bookshelf and 4 boards are there, it's going to combine those. And then the combined entity is going to come down here to this second assemble step. Now we say, okay, now I need, in addition to that, I need 8 nails. Okay, a really simple model. And so if I execute this model, you'll see that we're having these things that are, arriving. In this model, I have them all arriving at different rates and all of that kind of stuff. We really don't need that level, but this would be kind of a typical way to do this. Okay, and if you look at this, I'm going to stop here, pause. I'm going to actually stop the model, and then I'm going to go here and put a breakpoint so that I can stop the model and look at a couple of these things. So I'm going to go to run here, put a breakpoint there. And so that breakpoint on that input node says the first entity that hits that input node, the model will stop. Okay, so let me just run it here. Our first one should be there soon enough. There it is. So now it's stopped, and down here you can see over here in the left corner, breakpoint, meaning the model's paused on a breakpoint. Okay, now I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to use watch because I said I wanted to do that. And to use watch, I can do 2 things. One is I can pick a particular entity instance or realization and say, hey, I want to watch this. Or I can watch the whole model overall. Well, I'm going to watch this, not the input. I'm going to try to get my bookshelf. Nope. Zoom in a little bit. Here's my bookshelf. Bookshelf, watch. So that opens the watch window, and there's my bookshelf. And I'm going to go and also watch my assemble. Okay, and what watch lets me do is interrogate the instance and see all kinds of useful stuff about that instance. So for example, if I want to see the structure of my bookshelf entity, right, I can just open it and say, okay, well, I know that I've gone through 2 combiners. And so what I'm looking at here is my batch member queue, which is right there. And so there are all of the individual entities that comprise that batch. Since I have these, I can go look at any of these. If I wanted to see, for example, hey, what's going on with board 46? Like when did it arrive and all of that stuff, it's all there, right? And so I can look at that in the watch window and see, anything I want to see, about that, about my batch. And similarly with my assemble, I can see anything I want about that, which includes I can see the buffers. So I can go here and say, hey, what's waiting in the input buffer, right? Doesn't look like anything's waiting there, but I can just go say, let's look at the member input buffer contents. So they have I'm over here. I'm in the wrong place. I'm looking at this one right here. And so there are all the nails that are waiting in the member, in the member input buffer. Right? So I can see all that stuff, but I can also see functions associated with that object. So back, for example, I can see the capacity. So if I was doing some experimentation on, say, work schedules, here's where I would see what the actual capacity is at any given simulation time. So if I want to see how the work schedule changes that, set up a watch and watch it execute. Okay? And you can do this in combination with trace to see, meaningful information and learn about what's going on. In particular, when you see things that you don't know why it's doing a particular thing that it's doing, through this combination of watch and trace and little animation things like that input, that user label there showing the input, that's how we learn about what's going on in the model, right? And when you ask me a question, that's the information I want from you. I want you to say, I'm trying to do this. I set up this watch and I set up the trace and here's what I'm seeing and I don't know why this decision is being made. Right, so that's the level that I want you to look at it because that's really how you learn to do modeling. Right? It's not me telling you. It's not me saying use this mechanism or this technique. It's like doing it and looking at the trace and all of that. Right? For anything other than these trivially easy models, you have to be able to do this or you'll never be able to get the models done. Okay? All right. So let's go back to my model here. I'm going to stop it here because we don't really need it anymore. Right? And so this method is used a lot of times when you have a model like this. But when you look at this, what I just stopped the model, I meant to leave it here with my bookshelf, is that you have a lot of information, right, associated with all of the constituent entities. Right? So my 4 boards and my nails and all of that. And so if for whatever reason you need that, if you want to show the animation of those, or you need to have legacy information, like I need to know when a particular board was created, or I have entity states that I have recorded information on, then this is the way to do it. Okay? But a lot of times you don't need any of that. What I really need, all I really need to be able to do what I want to do is to know that I create the bookshelf based on 4 boards and the nails. And so what I really need is just some way to keep count. How many boards do I have? How many nails do I have? How do I use up the materials? And how do I add more materials? Okay, so you can think of it as just a number that Simio tracks internally. Okay, and that's what a material is. Right? So a material is an element. It's a Simio element that represents discrete consumable resources. There's no animation. There's a little bit of information about the quantity and all of that, as we will see, but we don't have logic that we do associated with an entity. Right? You don't route it places or any of that. It's just a thing that you can consume and you can add to. Okay? So materials can either be consumed or produced. So I have a material. You can think about a material as an inventory of things. I can consume them and I can produce them. Okay? And so typically material is consumed is specified as a bill of material, and the material produced is the material itself. Okay, so I'm going to show that same example using this Simbit. Since we haven't done a Simbit in class, I decided I would go through the whole process of opening the Simbit here. Hopefully you guys have seen that. I'm going to go back to my model here, go to support, Simbit, and I've already done the search process. So I searched for the Simbit that I knew I want, server with material use. And so I am just going to, and if you didn't know this, when you open a Simbit, there are 2 ways you can open a Simbit. I can click on it, and what it will do, if I click on it, it will open a new instance of Simio, unlicensed, right, and open that model in it. So you've got 2 instances. You've got the model you were originally doing, and then you've got the Simbit model. Or you can hold down the Shift key and click it, and it will open the Simbit in the model instance that you have open. Okay, so I'm going to do that because it works a little faster. And so it's saying, hey, you made changes to your model. Do you want to save them? I don't. I'm going to say I don't want to save them. And now it's going to open the Simbit. Okay, we don't need the help here. And so what the Simbit does is it does that exact same model, the model concept, except it uses materials. And we have three materials. We have nails, we have board, and we have the bookshelf. So if I go over and look at my definitions, there's my wood, or I guess I call them boards, but it's really wood. And I define, really all I define here is that it has an initial quantity of 200. So I have 200 of these things. Okay? Then I have nails. I have 400 of those things. Okay? Then I have bookshelf. I have none of these, but I've also specified a bill of materials for this. Okay? And so when I open this, it says, oh, okay, here's the bill of materials for your bookshelf. You need 8 units of nails and 4 units of wood. Okay, so those are both materials. 3 materials, 2 like sort of basic materials, and 1 bill of materials. Okay, so we've defined that structure in the bill of material. And then, when I do my server, I have a task sequence which has 2 tasks. The first task basically says, I have a material requirement here. Here, material requirement. And so when I did the last video module where we used secondary resources, I mentioned that the next thing we were going to look at was material requirements. So this first material requirement says, hey, I'm going to consume the bill of materials for a bookshelf. So what that's going to do is it's going to go out and grab 4 pieces of wood and 8 nails. Okay, it's going to remove those from their respective inventories. Okay, so I'm going to have whatever the numbers were, 400 less 4 and 800 less 8, or whatever those numbers were, right, in my inventory. Then the next step that it's going to do is it's going to produce a bookshelf. So I consume the bill of materials, the nails and the wood, and then I produce a bookshelf. So I have manipulated all 3 material inventories. I've consumed 2 to build the bookshelf, and then I've created a bookshelf. Okay, and all of those are tracked as the model runs. So when I execute my model, you can see we have this running track of nails consumed and bookshelf produced, and you can see that we're consuming and producing in this ratio of 8 nails, 4 pieces of wood for each bookshelf. Okay, and so I think we had enough material to do 50. And so if I just run this in fast forward mode, you can see it ran, and I produced 50. So I consumed all my nails, and I consumed all my wood, and I produced 50 bookshelves. Okay? But one thing about this particular Simbit is it has a limit to how many you produce. It's saying, okay, I only produce 50. Well, I have enough inventory to do 50, so everything works well. But if I didn't have that limit, so let's say, for example, I had 55, and I run that, and I fast forward. Okay, well, now when the model terminates, I still have 5 entities. So why do I have those 5 entities? I don't have the raw materials. So that entity that's sitting at the server is sitting there in that task saying consume. And it's trying to grab 8 nails and 4 boards, and none of that is available. So it just sits and won't ever proceed unless I replenish that inventory through a produce step. Okay? And so that concept is really important to materials, is you consume it and you produce it, but it's a constraint. When I have a task that says consume this material, the material doesn't exist, it doesn't proceed. Yeah.
So the entities on the board now represent like orders for the bookshelves?
It would be like an order or something. That's a great point, because what I was going to say is those entities don't represent bookshelves anymore. So in our model where we use the 2 combiners, we had an entity that represents the bookshelf. Here we don't. The order that you mentioned is one way to look at it. So you can think of these as customers coming in to buy a bookshelf. And so the entity itself, has no connection to the bookshelf or the materials. We're just consuming materials and producing materials, but they're no way tied to those entities once they go through that task sequence. Okay? So the second one in this Simbit, the second thing in this Simbit is say, hey, let's replenish the inventory. And so what the second one basically does is it says, when we run out of inventory, let's create some new inventory. Okay, so if I run this one, you can see what's happening. If I'll just run it, and then we'll talk about how it works. We're consuming up our inventories there, and then we're just replenishing them, right? So we're consuming nails at the rate of 8 per and wood at 4 per, and then when they get down to 0, you just replenish them. Okay? And so that replenishment process is a really simplified replenishment process that is in the Simbit. It's based on something called a monitor. So we have two monitors set up. We have a wood monitor and we have a nail monitor. And what the monitor basically does is it looks at a state variable and it looks for a couple of different conditions. The condition that we're looking for is something called a crossing state change. So with a crossing state change, we define a point and we say when the level of that state variable crosses that point, trigger an event. Okay, and we're looking for a negative cross. So basically we're saying, I'm starting up here and here's my target. When it hits that target, fire the event. Okay, and my target threshold value here is 10, and my target threshold value for nails is 20. Okay, and so what happens then is we just have two processes where we just have a delay and then we have a produce. So the delay represents, whatever delay it is, so you're going to go to the back room and get some more nails and go to the back room and get some more wood to come to your assembly station. And then we produce. Okay, and so in this case, we're just producing a fixed number of 80 nails and a fixed number of 40 pieces of wood. And so that's how that's happening, is when the inventory levels go down to the trigger point of the monitor, it fires the event. The event then causes the process to execute. And when the process executes, there's a lag. You can see the lag here somewhere. Once it crosses 10, there's a lag between right here when it crossed 10 and when it actually spiked up. That's that delay lag for, going back to the back room or whatever. Okay? Pretty straightforward. Anybody have any questions for me on that? Okay. We're going to build just a really simple model here and talk about some of the additional details about how this works. Okay, we're going to build about the simplest one we can build. Since I'm doing it in class, I don't like to build complex models in class because it usually ends badly. So I'm going to build a basic material example, and I'm going to define a widget, and I'm going to have 50 of them in stock. I'm going to define a material name widget, and then I'm going to produce an entity that consumes 4 of them, just like we did before, except I'm not going to produce anything. So I'm not doing a bill of materials. I'm just having one material. I'm consuming it. Okay? See if I can do that here. Let's see. Here's my empty Simio model. And so I can go to definitions, and I'm going to create a material. I'm going to name it widget. And I'm going to have an initial quantity. What did I say, 50? 50. My initial quantity of 50. Okay? I'm going to go back to my model, and I'm going to define a source server sync. I'm going to connect these with, I don't know, it doesn't matter, paths, connectors. Let's use connectors. Connect these guys with connectors. I could run it from here. I haven't done anything, so we're just using all the default properties, so we haven't even connected it up to the material yet. But as I say continually when I do modeling, I always like to check as I go so I don't get anything surprising. So it all looks good so far. So then I'm going to go in and say, hey, I want to consume those inventories, so I need to change that from a specific time to a task sequence. So I'll just pop open my task sequence, and we will just define one step. I don't know, get widgets. And go down to my material requirements, and the material that I want is widgets, and my required quantity is 4. Okay? So I have 50 of those guys in inventory, and I need 4 at a time. Right? So if I run my model, it should eventually stop, right? Because I'm going to run out of inventory. Looks like I might have, well, they're still going. It's like I probably ran out. I probably ran out now. Of course, we can't see because we don't have anything helping us out. So let's just add a couple of little indicators that we can see. Okay, so the first one I'm going to add is the ones that actually make it through the sink. So I'm just going to add a status label here. And this is going to be, you note that this status label is tied to the sink because I had the sink selected when I added it. It's tied to it. So I just need to do input buffer number entered. Number entered. Run that. Just make sure. Yep. So every time an entity comes through here, that means I've successfully produced them. And if I'm consuming them 4 at a time, how many should I get? 12? 12 times 4 is 48? Yeah, so I've got my 12, and now I'm just going to continue grabbing those. Okay, so far all looks good. I'm going to add one more thing. I'm going to add a status plot here so that we can track this. All right, so I'm going to go back and to my animation and add a status plot. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And we're going to call this widget inventory. And I want to track two things. I'm going to track the current inventory, which is called quantity in stock. And I'm going to track something called the backordered quantity. Okay? And then we're going to talk about what those are. So I'm going to grab this guy. And since I know I want two of them, I'll just go ahead and open the repeat group. Add the first one. And this is widget quantity in stock. Quantity in stock, and we will just call this in stock, and then we'll add a second one for backordered. So this is widget quantity backordered. Backordered. Thank you. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so I run my model. There we are at 50. You can now go see it being consumed. Get to 0. Everything stops. Right? We have this one backorder thing. Right? And so what's happened there is when the entity, the 13th entity arrived, we only had 2 widgets in inventory. Right? It needed 4. So it made a backorder request. And that's why we see the backorder jump up to 2. Okay, and so that backorder is associated with that with the consumes task for this entity. These guys haven't even gotten into the server yet. And if I don't do anything else, this is where it'll stay. Right, so nothing else interesting happens here. Okay, one quick note here is that the material inventory is in no way tied to just this seize delay release sequence, right? It's associated with the model. So if I were to go here and say, let's zoom out a second, and let's just replicate this. I don't want to replicate that. I just want to replicate my seize delay release. So I just copy it, paste a couple more in. I just paste all those in. Now I have 3 independent ones, okay? And they're all seizing from the exact same inventory set. So there aren't 3 different materials. There's one material called widget, right? And all 3 of these are pulling from that same inventory. And that's the critical part, is it's in no way tied to that server or this particular sequence of steps that I have. It's global. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, let's get rid of these guys. Get rid of these guys. Go back in here. Go back to my PowerPoint here. And let's look at a couple of things that are related to the material element and then think about replenishment. Okay, so a couple things are, we have these advanced options here. The first one is assume infinite availability if. And what happens here is we can let the stock go negative. Okay, so if I go back to my model, oops, I didn't mean to close that. Open that guy back up. Go back to my model and go back to material. And say, hey, I'm going to open the advance, and I'm just going to set this condition to true, to 1. Right? It's an if condition, so it's just looking for a binary. And since it's 1, that means it's always true. And now what's going to happen is it's going to let the inventory go negative, and it's going to not hold the entities up. Okay, so now when our inventory gets negative, now it just says, okay, I'm recording it, but I'm not holding the entities up. So now I know that, I'm not blocking, but I also know how many entities, that I've allowed to go negative. Okay? And so that's one thing that we want to do sometimes. And this other thing is allow backorder. So go back to my model, reset this guy, and this allow backorder policy. So the allow backorder policy basically says I want to always allow backorders. And that's why when we deplenish the inventory, we saw that backorder spike, right? Because we always allow backorders. I can also say I don't want to allow backorders, right? I can either say I never want to allow backorders, or I can make it conditional or probabilistic. And if I don't allow back orders and run, my inventory goes down just like it did before, except then it stops, right? It's at 0 here. But we haven't blocked any entities, right? We're still counting up entities here. Right, we can't see them because I didn't have any processing time, so they're just going through in 0 time. But we're still producing them. So when I say don't allow back ordering, then 2 things happen. One is I don't let the inventory go negative, but I also don't block. Okay, because the reason I might want to do that is because I might want to handle that myself. And so if I go and look in my definition, I say allow back order, we have something called the on-balk process. And so every time an entity hits that consume, it's not going to block the entity, but it will trigger this process, and I can do whatever I want. Like I could destroy the entity, or I could send it somewhere else, or I'm essentially handling that back order myself through process logic if I have those values set. Okay. Let's go back here. I want to set this one back, get it back to the way it was. Reset that guy. Okay, let's see. Let me just make sure everything should be set the way it was before. So I should get down to 0 and everything should stop. I should see 1 back order of 2. Yeah, there we go. So now we're back to where we were before. And replenishment, so I could use that monitor element just like we did in the Simbit, right? So if I want to replenish, I could use the monitor element and create a process and trigger and all of that kind of stuff. Here we want to do something a little bit different. We want to look at much more comprehensive replenishment policy. Okay, I want to do an inventory replenishment policy. So we have to look at what we mean by replenishment policy. So the policy is basically saying, I want to answer 2 questions. When should orders be placed to replenish, and how much should I order? So when we talk about inventory policy, replenishment policy, we're answering those 2 questions. When should I do something, and how much should I order? Okay, and we have some terms that we have to define. One is inventory position. So inventory position is stuff I have in stock plus anything I have on order minus any back order. So just traditional inventory position, a definition that you should have learned in 3700 or wherever you took ops planning. Continuous or periodic review. So a continuous review policy basically says every time I consume inventory, I evaluate the policy. Okay, so if I take one out, I say, hey, am I at my reorder point? Every single time. That's continuous review. Periodic review says I'm going to do my review on some type of period, like every day or every month or every week, right? And so I don't evaluate every time I consume. Then we have the actual policies themselves, and there are a whole bunch of different replenishment policies. Commonly used policies that I have here include a min-max, order up to, reorder point, reorder quantity, user-coded policies, and so on. And all of these are implemented in Simio, and you can look in the Simio help for details for all of them other than the one that I'm going to talk about, reorder point, reorder quantity, also known as an SS inventory policy in some places. And what a reorder point, reorder quantity says is I'm going to, when my inventory hits a particular point, little s, I'm going to order a fixed amount. And that fixed amount is some factor of big S, usually 1 times big S, but it can be multiple times big S depending on when the actual order happens. Okay, so we're just going to kind of think of it as little s and big S for the time being. Okay, and you can see the inventory position plots over time for our continuous view and our periodic review. Okay, and these are really simple implementations where we don't have any order lead time. When I make an order, I get the inventory immediately. Okay, so you can see what happens in our continuous review policy. Then as soon as I reorder it, I get it. Right, so I reorder at that point, that little red dot, and I get whatever I order. In my periodic review, I got to my reorder point right here in between the T1 review period and the T2. So I got it here. And then I ordered it here when I reviewed the inventory. So we have these little lags here that are possible between when you actually get to the reorder point and when you inspect the inventory. Important to note that this is not the same as the lead time, which we also see. So if I order something from Amazon or whatever, I have a lead time of 1 day, 2 days, whatever it happens to be. So that's different than this review period. right? So if you're in a situation where you have a lead time, there's another delay between when you get it. Okay? Does that make sense? And as I said, there are several more inventory policies that are built into Simio.
On that other slide,
Yeah.
if there was a lead time, obviously the reorder point would be followed by like more like
Yeah, you're probably going to have more consumption before you go up, because during the lead time, you don't stop the inventory. You don't stop the consumption process typically, right? And so depending on what the lead time policy is, that's what leads to your decision of what little s is, your safety stock level. Is if you have demand over lead time that's a big number, you want to make sure that your inventory, your little s, covers that expected demand over lead time. Okay?
Can you do the reorder point using the quantity instead of time? Like I want to reorder once we are 5.
Well, this is that. Little s is quantity. So you see an inventory position going down, 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 and when it hits below that little s, you reorders, right? Here, the time element is the review period, right? So this is still my reorder point. I just haven't reviewed the policy yet. Okay? Okay, so Simio material elements implement this. They let you implement this policy. Okay, so we're going to go back to our model and do a continuous review, reorder point, reorder quantity with parameters 10, 100. Okay, so let me go back to my model, go back to my definitions. Here's my widget, and you can see right here I have this review period. So it's default none, so we don't ever look at it by default. We want a continuous review, and when I choose that, it has these additional properties of, hey, do you want a replenishment policy? Of course we do. We want a reorder point, reorder quantity, and we want the reorder point to be 10, and we want the reorder quantity to be 100. Okay? Now, the most common mistake people make when they're new to material and inventory elements is to say, okay, I've implemented my policy. Okay, but if you run this, you're going to see that in actuality, you haven't implemented your policy. You've defined the policy, but you have not yet implemented it. Right? So when I run it, it's going to get down. It's going to be in the exact same position that we were in before. Right? So nothing's changed. So I've defined my policy. There is a policy associated with that material, but I haven't said execute that. Okay? So number one mistake I see when people first start doing that. And of course, what we have to do is we have to do this on replenishment order process, because the replenishment order process is how you actually implement the replenishment. So we'll just double click there, and it opens up the process editor. And so what we're going to do in our process is we're going to use a produce step, because we're not going to have any lead time or anything here. We're not consuming from one place and producing in another. We're just going to do that strict replenishment protection. So I'm going to add a produce step, and then the only thing I need to decide is what it's going to give me. Okay, so just bear with me for a second. We want token material order detail quantity. So I go back to my model and produce right there. And I want to produce widget. And the quantity that I want is token material order detail quantity. Okay, and now when I go back and run my model, when it gets down to 10, we should replenish. And we should replenish instantaneously, which we just did. Right? And because we're replenishing instantaneously, it's always going to go back up to that same number. Right? And so you can see that we're not doing it at a time. We're doing it when it hits that number of 10. When it gets to 10, it's immediately going to go back up. And because it's instantaneous, it's always going to go back up to the exact same number. If we had any kind of lead time delay or something like that, that top level max inventory wouldn't be variable. Okay?
For that, you just add a delay step to the process?
Sure. I could add a delay. So I could go in before that produce and say delay. And if I knew my delay, was randomly between 1 and 3 days, put a delay random 1 and 3 days. The consumption would continue, and then you would do the and that's the kind of stuff that we see in the video that I did for this week. So I'm going to do that. I do that in detail.
We have to add the process for implementing the replenishment.
You do. So the replenishment is defined, but it's not implemented. Okay, so go back to my slides here. And what I'm interested in is this guy, which I said I'd come back to, token material order detail. So what the inventory replenishment policy does is basically a little more than this, but basically what it does is it fills in this material order detail. And the material order detail is defined by the inventory policy. Okay? In particular, we have the quantity. Right? So the one thing it defines is if we have a reorder point, reorder quantity, is it sets the trigger when it crosses the inventory level descending, sets the trigger, executes the process, but at the same time it writes all of this information. And for this really simple one, all we care about is that material order detail dot quantity right there. Right? So no, I didn't set that. Right? It was set by the policy. Okay? And so this is another thing that you can use watch to see this. Okay, so let me show you how you would find that. If you wanted to see that how that was executing, I could go in my model, and this is happening in a process. Okay, and since this is a task level process, this process is in the model space. The process is executing in the model space. Okay, so if I say, hey, let's set a breakpoint there, and then run, not that, run. And as soon as it gets down to 10 or 0, I can't remember what it is. Yeah, 10, there we are. We're at our breakpoint. Okay? So now I can go to my project home, open my watch window, and what I need to find is I need to find the token. I need to find the token that's executing this process because that's what I want to see the information about. Okay, so if I just open up my model, here, scroll to the bottom, here are the processes, and it's saying, hey, there's one token in one process because it's a really simple model. I have that one replenishment process, and there's only one token in it. So I just open up processes, and here's my token, and there are my functions, and right there is the material order detail right here. So it's saying my materials widget, there's no source inventory, there's no destination inventory because we haven't dealt with inventories yet. We have a quantity of 100, and we haven't said anything about lot ID. Right? So the replenishment policy itself filled that in, and now it's my job to use that information however I see fit. Okay? And how we saw fit to do it in the simple model is to say, hey, read the quantity and just produce that many. Okay? But we could have arbitrarily complex logic, too. I could say, hey, I need 100. I have 5 different suppliers. Let me go figure out who's the cheapest and produce from them. Right, and so that's the kind of logic that you would add into the process. There's that guy. Oh, before I go, let me just again reiterate the fact that if you want to get token information, which you will a lot when you're doing detailed models, watch the model, scroll down to the processes that are active, and in a general model, you might have a whole bunch of them active. And you can see all of the individual tokens, and you can see all of the components associated with each token that you have. Yeah.
So this is what you mentioned where it's like continuously checking the inventory level, right? And so, but you put the breakpoint only at the point where it like was about to reorder. Is that it, or?
Yeah. So the breakpoint is set on that produce step. So the stop is going to happen just prior to that. So if I click step, it would execute that single step and consume that. Produce that level.
Before that, every token comes through, it checks the inventory or the current inventory level and says, is it at the reorder point?
Not in this process, because this process is the replenishment process. Where it gets checked, close this guy, go back here, is right here. So when I say consume this, okay, it's going to check it right there. So it's going to consume 4 if 4 exists. Right? And at the same time, it's going to check that inventory policy. If it's a continuous order policy anyway, it's going to check it right then. And in this case, if it was down at 10, it would then execute that process. Okay? So token material order detail is something, and again, when you want to use this is when you're saying, what's going on? Why is this not working? Right? When we talk about inventories, for example, you're going to say, hey, I'm sending it to the wrong place, or I'm retrieving it from the wrong place. You need to be able to go in and look at the model and say, what's the model? How's the model executing this? What's it doing? Okay, trace, watch, Simbits, animation elements, really helpful. Okay. So the general replenishment behavior looks sort of like this. We have this for material and inventory elements. Haven't talked about inventory elements, but I'm going to in just a second. So we have this review period, which is set by the replenishment policy, and that period can either be a period, like a time, when a trigger is set and you replenish, or it can be the continuous policy, which happens every time you have a consume. All right, so we trigger that policy, and that executes the on-replenishment order process. So that's that little begin the process, and the token that executes that process has material order detail in it. Okay, so the token executing the process has that. I have all of this detail here that I have, logic, sourcing policies, order modifiers. I'm making decisions about what am I going to do with this information. In general, if you think at two different categories of models, you have something like called a supplier model, like I'm going to go get it from the back room, which is sort of like what our Simbit did, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to consume from another inventory or another material stash. If I'm doing a manufacturing, then I'm going to actually manufacture something. So I'm going to trigger a manufacturing event here. Once either one of those occur, then I'm going to produce to my inventory. Okay, so that's the general logic that it follows, and what we need to sort of code in are these order modifiers to suit whatever situation you have. Okay? Inventory. Inventory is like a storage bucket. Okay, so when we've talked about materials, you just have this big, well, it's a big bucket of materials that's global to the model. Right? So I said I have 50 widgets. I have 50 widgets. Okay? What an inventory element does is it lets you divide the material inventory to physical locations in your model. Okay? And so, like this example right here, I have material, widgets, and I might have those widgets in 3 different places in my model. Okay? So, for a multiple storage locations in a facility, I have my assembly line, I have my loading dock, and I have my warehouse, all in my manufacturing facility. And I can have widgets on the manufacturing line, I can have widgets in inventory in the warehouse, and I can have widgets on the loading dock, right? And so I can do things with the inventories at individual locations, but I can also see the overall inventory for that material. And then in multiple city supply chain network, you know, you have a manufacturer, a distribution center, a retailer. Customers come in and buy from here. This is replenished from here. This is replenished from here. This is replenished by doing a manufacturing process. So I have inventory, 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 and I'm sort of moving things between those inventories. Okay, so it has the exact same replenishment process that the materials do. Okay? So you can see that I just have the dialog box, and so this is an inventory element. It looks an awful lot like the replenishment process that we saw for the material, right? The only thing that's really different here is it says, hey, what is the material? The other thing that's different is you have something called a site object name, okay? Because an inventory is tied to a physical location in your model. You have to say, I'm going to associate this inventory with this object, an object instance in your model. Okay, then I can have replenishment policies and so on. Okay, so let me just look at this really quick, modify a really quick example here, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do in the video module and what we're going to do next. Okay, so we want to take this basic inventory model that we just did and make this into a really simple manufacturing process where we have manufacturing here and we have a warehouse up there. And so we have an inventory here, small amount, which we use for our manufacturing process. And I have a big amount in my warehouse, and I want to replenish from my warehouse to my manufacturing. Okay? That's my objective. I don't think I have anything else. Nope. So we just implement. So I'm going to make this model into that model. Okay? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my site object. Remember that inventories are tied to a site object. So by manufacturing one I already have, we'll just rename this guy manufacturing. If I can rename. Oh, that's not right. There we go, manufacturing. So I have a site object, it's a server named manufacturing, and now I need a site object for my warehouse. Well, we're not doing anything at our warehouse, so I'm just going to use the simplest object, which is a basic node. And I'm going to call my basic node warehouse. Warehouse. Okay? Now I go back to my definitions, And the first thing I'm going to do is go to my widget. I'm going to get rid of, reset these because I'm not going to use those. Then I'm going to go to this very top thing and say, hey, this is location based. And as soon as I do that, you see that all of the other things go away, right? So that you don't need a replenishment policy. You don't need an initial inventory because the initial quantity is at those physical locations. Right? So you can't have both this global batch and a whole bunch of individual batches. It's one or the other. Either you have global to the model or you have individual. Of course, I could make one, I could make an inventory element that's everywhere except my site objects if I wanted to. I'm not going to in this case. Right, and then I create two inventories. So I'm going to just create two inventories. Let's just call this INV MFG for manufacturing, and INV warehouse for my warehouse. So I've created those two inventories, and now I need to say, hey, how are these inventories going to work? So first thing is I'm just going to do the material name. This is going to be widgets. And as I said, I need to do a site object name. So my manufacturing is going to be manufacturing, wherever that is, right there. And let's say that we have 50 there. And my warehouse, same material, widget. My site object name now is my basic node that I named warehouse. And I don't know, let's say we have 100 there. Okay, so now I've taken my inventory of widgets and put 50 of them at the manufacturing facility and 50 of them in the warehouse. Okay, I'm going to go back to my facility, change up my widget inventory. Now, in stock is widget quantity in stock, but I'm not so much interested in widget anymore. I'm interested in particular inventories. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this guy and then make this inventory manufacturing quantity in stock. So we'll just call this manufacturing. And get rid of backordered and call this my warehouse inventory. And this is inventory. Quantity in stock. Okay, so now I've said I don't care about backorder now. I could include backorder if I wanted to, but I don't want to in this example. So now I have two inventories, one at manufacturing, one at the warehouse. Okay? Last thing I need to do is come back in my consumption here and say, hey, I need to grab from particular inventory. All right, so this inventory site type, I'm going to grab from the parent object. Okay, so here I have three choices. I can do the parent object, the associated object, and a specific object. So I could go in and say specific object manufacturing, but since it's a task sequence, I'm just going to use the parent object. Note, in the video module, I talk about that in a lot of detail, why that is and how to look this up and how to figure out what it is. So I'm not going to do that here, but I do that in the video for Friday. So we're going to do parent object widget 4, parent object 4, close. Now, if we have any luck, it should work. So there are my two inventories. There's my warehouse there, and there's my manufacturing. And of course, we don't have a replenishment policy yet, right? So we just consumed all the 50 that we had, and now it's just blocked like it was before. We didn't do anything with our warehouse inventory yet, so it's still there. Okay, let me for the 500th time reiterate how important it is to make a small change and run, and make a small change and run, and make a small change and run to make sure that you're implementing. Because you try to do the whole thing at once, you're going to spend more time trying to chase down errors. Last thing we're going to do here in class is we'll just set the replenishment policy for manufacturing. So now I'm going to replenish my manufacturing inventory. So I'll go back to my definitions. Manufacturing, let's do continuous review. Reorder point, reorder quantity, 10, 25. 25. Okay, so now I've set the policy, but again, it's not going to implement yet because I have to give it a process, which I will. And now I have two steps. I'm going to consume, because what I want to do is consume from the warehouse, produce to the manufacturing. Okay, so here I am, manufacturing add-on process. I'm going to, where's my consume? Consume material widget. Okay, and so now we need to specify the object. So I'm sitting here in a task, in an add-on process for the manufacturing. So I have no relationship to the warehouse. It's not my parent object, it's not my context object, it's not my associated object. So this is why I pick specific object. Specific object that I pick is warehouse. And note that I'm picking the site object, not the inventory. So I have an inventory INV, WHSE, and INV, but we don't use those for produce and consume. We use the site object. Okay? And then our friend token.material order detail quantity, token.material detail order quantity. Okay, so we're going to consume it. And then we're going to produce it. And my produce, I'm going to produce material of widget. My site inventory type. Here I can do the associated object because it's an add-on process associated with the manufacturing site. So I can do associated object. I can also do specific object. And this is where, if there's any question, use the watch. So you can pull up the watch and you can say, hey, what's the associated object? What's the context object? What's the parent object? And the reason that's important, which we won't see here, later on, if you use the context and associated objects, then we can use generic replenishment processes. We don't have to have a separate replenishment policy for every inventory. We can create a generic one, right? And use it for any replenishment because we're using that structure. We're not going to do that here, but that's why we use these things. So our basic friend again, token, material order detail quantity. There we go. So I consume from the warehouse. I produce to the manufacturing, hopefully, and now we run. Fingers crossed, we get down to 10, and then we grab from, we consume from the warehouse and produce to the manufacturing. Sooner or later, we're going to run out, probably around there. Now we can't produce anymore because we're out in the warehouse, we're out in manufacturing, and so we can't do anything. Of course, I could always go in manufacturing, so I could go. Now, if I didn't want to deal with my warehouse, I could just go to warehouse and say, hey, let's make this always available. Just make that allow negative inventory. And if I do, it will then do the consume and produce, and all of that stuff as we expect, but the inventory just goes negative, but you see the replenishment process. Hopefully it's going to work out that way. We're about to see. So it does, so the consume, it lets it go negative, and then the produce still executes. So the fact that there was nothing to consume, we just consumed a negative quantity, doesn't affect the produce. We still produce like we have it. Okay, and of course, you would, if in a situation like that, you'd have some logic associated with what you really want to happen when that scenario occurs. Okay. So in this week's video module, I do a much more detailed example, multi-level supply chain model where we implement different policies and talk about how to do that and all of that. So have a look at that. And the other video I talk about, I think I call these utility tools or something. There are a couple of concepts that involve material and inventory that I just talk about for future use. One of them is using a transfer step to route, which we'll talk about. One of them is using defining a bill of materials in a data table. What's the third one? Constraint elements. Okay, so there's 3 basic topics that I talk about. We don't time into a particular model. Okay? So let me just spend another couple seconds of saying where we're going with all of this. So far, as I said, we're kind of almost there. But if you look at what our strategy going forward is, here's the model, the last model from video module 3, right, our task sequence. Okay, and if you remember, what we did here is we defined our parts. We have our part and our part sequence and tasks and all of that stuff. Okay, but if we look at the part table, we defined these as string properties and talked about that quite a bit, about why we use string property rather than entity type. Okay, so what our next step is to use material elements. Okay, so if I go here and say, let's go to part right here and the schema, and let's change its type to material. Okay? And now let's go in and instead of having a reference, let's make that a create. And because I'm creating it dynamically, I have to first delete everything. So let me just Control X here, delete them, Control V, paste them back in. Now, when I go to my definitions, voila, we've auto-created all of our 3 material elements. Okay? And then I can just clean everything up by going back and saying, okay, this needs to be a column key. There we are. So now everything is back to order, but now all of my parts here are materials that were created. And with that comes the ability to define bill of materials, to define replenishment policies, all of that stuff. Okay, so way back when you guys said, why are we using strings rather than entities? I knew where we were going, but I didn't want to explain it then because I wanted us to talk about material inventory first. But that's where we're headed, is we're going to use material elements to define all of these different parts and raw materials and everything associated with our system. Okay, so we will get to that next week. We don't do that in this week's video. We will do that next week. That's one of the things we need to do before we get to the ISA 95 template. Okay. Anybody have any questions for me? Yeah.
I was taking a look at the discussion forums, and I don't think we have one for a video module for.
We don't have one? I'll put one up. Sorry about that. I will put that up this evening. Any other questions for me? Okay, so I will leave you with one thing. In the video modules this week, I explicitly say make sure you build this model because we are now stepping into from really kind of simple models to a little bit more involved models. So you want to make sure that you can build these models as you follow along in the video. And you can either build it as you follow along, or you can watch the whole video and stop and say, hey, can I build this from scratch? Whatever. Just make sure that you actually do it, because some of these things like associated object, context object, parent object, and all of that makes sense when you watch me do it. You being able to do it's a totally different thing. And so you want to make sure and give that a try. All right, see you guys next week.